Okay, it is my pleasure to introduce our next topic, the Alison Rose Review of Female Entrepreneurship, hosted by the fantastic Parmy Olson from the Wall Street Journal, with Dame Vivian Hunt and, of course, Alison Rose. Thank you, Parmy. Grab a round of applause, please.
All right, wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction. I think this is going to be a very fascinating conversation. We have two incredibly successful and high-powered women on the stage with us. I'm so excited to speak to both of you. Not only can you speak from personal experience as women in these in finance, in consultancy, but also you've been analyzing this stuff. So we're going to start with that. And Alison, the Rose Review is out, and you are making recommendations to governments, to businesses, to help promote gender diversity. Just kind of in a nutshell, what are the key points you want people to come away with and recommendations?
Yeah, so the review really looked at what are the barriers facing female entrepreneurs. And what I could see, and what everyone can see, is sort of problem hiding in plain sight, was there are a huge number of female entrepreneurs, but we didn't have as many as when I look across the globe at some best-in-class countries. And by that I mean places like Canada, Netherlands, Australia, US.
So Britain's behind.
So we are behind. However, we're a really entrepreneurial nation, and particularly a really big fintech nation. We're starting up almost 1,100 businesses starting up every day, but only 1 in 3 entrepreneurs are female. So we have a pipeline challenge, but more significantly, I guess the findings of the report were that only 1% of venture capital funding is going to female-led businesses.
1%.
1%. And male-led businesses at the point of scale-up are likely to get twice as much funding as female-led businesses at scale-up. And female entrepreneurs are less represented in the three highest growth sectors.
Is that better or worse than Silicon Valley?
I didn't look at Silicon Valley specifically. So, but that sort of bro culture, which I guess you're kind of getting at, I think there is an element of that. So we really tried to look at a very quantitative and qualitative set of research to say, what is the real opportunity here? And if we can get the level of female entrepreneurship in this country to the same level as male entrepreneurship, then you have an untapped potential of 250 billion contribution to the UK economy. And at a time when we're talking about growth, when we're talking about productivity, that feels like latent opportunity that we're leaving on the table. And so my recommendations were really, and the report really looked at what are the key barriers and what are the things that we should do. And I think it is one of those things where I'm making recommendations to say public sector, private sector, basically anyone who can help should help and get out of the way to really support this entrepreneurial sort of spirit and opportunity, and real entrepreneurs getting access to the funding, the support, the help right the way through the pipeline of their development.
Okay, great. And just bringing it over to Vivian Hunt, you're the director of McKinsey here in the UK and Ireland, and your company actually assisted with the development and the research that underpins the Rose Review. In addition to that, you guys have another report about how women are going to be affected by our big economic transition to automation. So this is kind of to Alison's point about what might be holding women back a bit. One of the main points of your that report was actually women might find it more challenging than men to adapt to this change brought about by automation. Why is that?
Well, the barriers to accessing the opportunities are higher for women. It really is as simple as that. If you take the example of entrepreneurship and scale-up of businesses, if women are today 1 out of 3, and it remains 1 out of 3, that certainly is well below parity of 50%. And so I really love the simplicity, Alison, of what the report says, which says, look, if we could get entrepreneurship up right across the country equally for women as for men, it's a big economic prize for the country. It's a big economic prize for the sectors. But today, women are punching below their weight on the investment side, the startup side, the scale-up side. So we have to catch up, because they're starting from a position of historical disadvantage.
And coming from the side is this wave of automation, which could make things more difficult for women?
Well, it's going to change the nature of work. And so what we did is we looked at how jobs were going to change. And yes, some jobs will go away, as the previous panel touched on, but many more. In fact, we think roughly an equivalent number of, on average, higher value jobs are going to be created, and work is going to be restructured. we estimate that up to 160 million women around the world will need to change their skill set or change their jobs. That's 1 out of 4, but it's the same rate as men. So if you're a man in a manufacturing or distribution sector, that sector today is 70% men in the UK, but 1 out of 4 or more of them will need to change. So the proportion of impact is the same for men and women. What's different for women? First is most women don't have the equivalent access to digital tools and analytic technologies as men. We looked at some emerging markets, so something as simple as a mobile phone. If there's one mobile phone in a household, typically the man will have access to it or manage it or control it.
Okay.
Internet access. In the UK, it's more about coursework and skills. Do women have the same training opportunities, the same access to courses, et cetera? And we know there are big differences in the female pipeline. Second big difference between men and women, mobility. I know it doesn't feel like you're in any way restricted in terms of your ambition and opportunities, but the reality is women's lives, particularly if you're working in a 2-career household, are very different than men's. One, women have 2 times the domestic and unpaid care work called laundry, dishes, care responsibilities for parents, all that stuff you do on your second shift. It makes a big difference. If the training course is at 6 p.m. and you're working a service job that gets out at 5 and you've got 2 kids, most times it's the woman who has to be home.
And
so
I hear...
There's a lot of reasons: mobility, technology access, skills training, which means that women and men are not at the same starting point.
And it strikes me, these are big cultural changes. It's almost overwhelming thinking about the changes that need to be made personally, within our own homes, within the workplace, within the government, within policy. So let's drill down into one specific recommendation that came out of your review, Alison, which I thought was quite interesting. So we know that now companies have to report on the gender pay gap within their firms, and you're suggesting that they take it a step further. Banks and investment funds in particular should sign up to a new Investing in Women code, which is where they track the amount of funding they actually give to female entrepreneurs. That strikes me as very interesting. And what I would love to also know is, what kind of feedback are you getting from banks, from investment funds? Are they sort of, yes, we'll do that, or are they a little bit hesitant?
Yeah, so the thinking, one of the big findings of the report, and I guess your point about, does this all feel very insurmountable and very difficult? Well, I think you're not going to fix it overnight, and there's no one silver bullet. So what we were trying to do was come up with what are the practical things. One of the big findings in terms of barriers, and this point around only 1% of VC money going to female entrepreneurs, is this lack of awareness and availability of capital. And when you look generally at funding as well, there's huge amounts of help and support out there, but actually knowing where to go and what's available is, I think, one of the barriers. And there are other elements to it. It's not that simple, but that's it. So the thinking behind the code is really as simple as creating transparency, making it very visible where there is funding available, the types of funding that is available, whether that is bank debt or VC debt. And one of the things I genuinely worry about from an entrepreneurial perspective is, because there isn't that visibility, you either find sort of entrepreneurs or small startup businesses end up, putting everything on a credit card and going the debt route, when actually that's the worst thing you can do as a startup. Or they end up going to VC and giving away all their equity at the wrong point when they should be keeping it. Yep. So the code was to create transparency. So 2 aspects. One was on the banking side and one was on the VC side. On the banking side, we very publicly said, let's publish. And even if the results are terrible, which I don't think they will be, let's be really visible. I'm delighted to say this is, as I said when I launched this isn't a competitive sport. This is everybody should help. So my organization, NatWest and RBS, have signed up. Lloyds, Santander, Barclays, HSBC have all signed up to the code. So I think that's really great that the banks are actually saying, fine, we will publish. And so we're working on what the data is. And also the Angel Investment Association are also doing the same. We have a task force working with the VC community at the moment to say, let's publish that and create transparency there as well, so that people know where to go. And I think it's about, if you don't measure it, it doesn't happen. I'm very simplistic realistic in this view. So creating that transparency and then being able to track it will hopefully be an incentive, and also create visibility around that. So I've had a really good reaction. I haven't had to really kind of pound on too many doors. People have been enthusiastically taking my phone call and being very supportive. So I think that's good.
And just to clarify, when you mean being found transparent, because they could just put it on a web page that nobody's ever going to see. I mean, is there a requirement to kind of publicize it in some way, those figures?
Yeah, so I think the point is the Treasury, who've been a big driver of this, are going to endorse the code. And my view is that we publish it and then we continue to publish it so we can track progress.
Okay.
I think the 30% club and this notion of having stretch targets across peer groups in business has done all of us a huge service, because this notion of we can mutually agree to more transparency, we don't have to wait for punitive measures, regulation, name and shame, all of that stuff that really is quite demotivating in business. And frankly, as a woman or any other historically underrepresented group, I don't want to feel like people have been forced to bring more diverse inputs to the table. You know, a woman entrepreneur who you're investing in, she should feel like it's the quality of her idea and her team that you're investing behind. So this notion of mutual accountability between peers, transparency, recognizing that it's a multi-step journey, but also looking for progress, you know, keeping a high bar around what progress looks like and measuring the difference. We know that gender pay gap and tracking that is a lagging, imperfect metric, but it is big and clear enough, with now having gone from 5 voluntary to 10,000 mandatory firms in the UK, that we will be able to see patterns, and there'll be clearly some companies that'll make more progress than others. Interestingly, it is often recruits and employees who are the most frequent users of the gender pay gap data set. They use it to make decisions about where they want to work, perhaps where you want to invest, et cetera. So I love the code as an example of one impact from these reviews that's actually making a difference in the real world of startups and tech. And secondly, that it's very specific to that industry, you know, the investing, primary and secondary capital industry. You might need something different in early stage biotech. You might need something different for scale-ups. You might need something different for established firms like Microsoft or Salesforce. But it has to be something that's relevant to the business leaders, because then they'll do it. They'll see the business benefit, and then it'll happen. They're not going to do it just because it's the right thing to do. If we wait for that, we'll be waiting too long.
Yeah, fair enough. Alison, a question to you. At your first meeting, reportedly as a senior RBS executive, you were apparently the only woman in the boardroom. And now there's talk of you being the front runner to potentially succeed Ross McEwan as the CEO of RBS when he leaves next year. Do you have ambitions to be CEO of RBS?
I think I'm pretty focused on my day job at the moment. It's quite busy, so I think I'll keep focusing on that for now.
Okay, fair enough. Hypothetically, if you were to be CEO of RBS, what kind of things would you do as one of Britain's biggest banks, lending to potential entrepreneurs to help boost female entrepreneurship in this country?
Yeah, so we're very focused on sort of supporting entrepreneurs. So one of the things that we launched 4 years ago now was entrepreneur accelerators right the way around the UK. One of the research showed us that actually knowing where to go to get help and fear of failure were 2 big reasons why people who wanted to start a business didn't start a business. So actually, as one of the biggest business lender in the UK, I felt that we should be doing more to help and support and connect the network and be a facilitator of that. So we set up 14 free accelerator hubs, which are right around the UK. The entrepreneurs don't need to bank with us. It's completely free. They go through an entrepreneur development program. And that was our way of saying, let's work out how to help. And we've partnered with different people and different firms, and we teach people how to pitch, how to write business plans, how to get access to financing. And the survival rate of companies that go through that program are, after 2 years, 87% are still trading. So it's a really big difference. And over 47% of them are female, despite the fact we don't set any quotas. And that, for me, is what as a big bank and a big lender and a big supporter of business, we should be doing.
So you didn't set out
practical, tailored help.
You didn't set out to tailor this to female entrepreneurs.
No,
but it ended
absolutely
up
not.
being nearly half instead of the 1 in 3 that you were saying is the norm.
And I think this is the point. If you set up tailored support and you're very visible about it, then you can make a real difference. So the other program that we have to help small SMEs and growing businesses, we have a Women in Business program, so qualified female relationship managers who support female-led businesses. Now, if you're a female-led business, you don't have to come to a female relationship manager, but if you don't want to go and talk to traditional relationship manager, there's this tailored program here, certified by the Chartered Institute of Bankers and endorsed by every woman. As a result of that tailored support, we've seen a 30% increase in the number of accounts opened by female-led businesses. So for me, it's about practical, direct support and help, and I think that's what all of us need to do. That's why I willingly share all of these examples, because I think if you create the right connectivity and ecosystem and support environment, you can actually make a real difference. And those tailored support programs, like our accelerators, like our Women in Business programs, they really we can see a direct impact of them. So for me, it's about putting in place practical help, fundamentally listening to what your customers want. What do entrepreneurs really need? And interestingly, the entrepreneur development program that we put our entrepreneurs through in our accelerator hubs, we're now putting our bankers through. So voluntarily, they get trained as well, and it teaches them about what an entrepreneur needs. So I think that's how, we need to do more of that. What is the problem we're trying to solve, and how can we practically help, and how can we partner with each other to help? Because I think that's where you bring the best in place to help.
Got it.
It's also an example of using some hard, concrete, practical steps, more openness to businesses, practical advice to help them lend, to help them develop business plans, and if you need lending or capital access and financial management, etc. That's a little bit the hardware, but also the software of an inclusive culture where entrepreneurs, in this case female, who may not have been historically represented, feel comfortable. We all know that sometimes the words on the door and the language and the programs can be right, but you still don't feel comfortable coming there with your business idea.
Yeah.
And so it's that combination of hardware and software, the concrete things that help all entrepreneurs, but also female-led entrepreneurs be successful, and then an environment that is not intimidating, off-putting, stereotypically male in its conduct. And that's important because we think things should be meritocratic, which we think of as like the top of this table, flat, level, even playing field. But the reality is we're starting from different points, like the bottom of this table. And you've got to recognize, if you're trying to reach entrepreneurs who haven't historically built businesses, you have to do more to make sure, in this case women, go from that bottom step to the top of the table.
Got it. Okay. Great point. Since we are at an AI conference, I want to steer the conversation a little bit towards AI and gender bias in AI, which I know, Vivian, is something you've also looked into quite a bit. But I actually want to bring this question initially to Alison, because there's a consumer-facing issue here when we think about chatbots. As just one example. So banks across Europe and the United States have been augmenting their customer services divisions with these chatbots. You can talk to them, it's all automated. And interestingly, if you actually look at the biggest banks across Europe, their customer service chatbots have names like Amy and Debbie, Inga, Mia, Erica, and Eva. I don't know if you're seeing a pattern here, but they're all female. And you could argue, actually, that naming these chatbots with female names and female personalities kind of enhances the stereotype of women making good assistants. I know Alison, NatWest has a chatbot called Cora. Should banks be personifying their chatbots as female?
So I think the broader, I think it's a really good point, and I think it's that level of unconscious bias. Are we sending signals that are creating an unconscious bias? And I think that's your point around sort of embedding bias in AI, and I think that's a really important point, and I think it's something we all need to be really mindful of. And it's certainly something when I talk to lots of women engineers and AI engineers in terms of saying, let's really make sure that we don't program in the bias that exists in the humans, and I think that's a thing we need to be really conscious of. I think it's a really good point. And when you step back and look at that, it's like, have we done that in the right way? Now, it's not done, if I think about our Cora chatbot, we tested that with lots of customers. We looked at, what worked, what made them feel comfortable. We're very transparent about the fact it's a chatbot, so it's not, it's not pretending that it's anything other than that. And that friendliness and openness and inclusiveness worked really well in terms of our testing with customers. So it wasn't a case of a group of men in a dark room who went, oh, I know, we'll give it a woman's name because that's what works. It was genuinely testing it. But I think the bigger point that you're making is, I think as we move into much more using AI and embedding in our AI, we need to make sure we're really smart about not embedding bias and really testing it. And I think, what we need to be aware of, a lot of this is machine learning, and then it's really where you're doing sort of really cognitive development, and I think it's being really smart about how we that. And I think with anything in unconscious bias, it's always that point of stepping back and going, did we really think about that? Did we really test that? And I think that's a constant sort of learning loop we have to go through as we're developing this.
Okay. Vivian, any thoughts?
Work is really gendered. When you look at the occupational patterns between men and women, it can be very different from one country to another, from one industry to another. Construction, distribution, a lot of machine manufacturing is 70% or more male. But interestingly, a lot of service roles, customer service roles, frontline service roles, healthcare assistants are 70+% female. Right across Europe, and we looked at OECD countries as well as some large, fast growth economies. So the reason why a lot of chatbots are female is because the vast majority of service roles where you interact with someone in person or on the phone, today they are female. So the challenge is you could actually build in more parity through the technology if you are conscious of the facts of the current gender distribution, wanted to have more parity because men might provide just the same excellent service as women, and then recognize that getting to real economic parity is going to take longer than the AI impact on our economy. So we shouldn't just always wrap ourselves on the hands and say it's bad. We have to understand what are the real patterns in work, which ones do we want to change, and then you could even use the technology to get ahead of where real work is. So I just want to use that as an example to highlight the fact that we're not starting from the same place. And so we just want to use the data to say, where are we? What outcome would we like? We prefer parity of interactions in service and maybe in other roles as well. How can we actually build towards that?
But how much do you think engineers and designers should step in and not go with the 70% norm or what people expect or what focus groups like and gravitate towards? To what extent should they be designing change into these kinds of systems?
It's a complex topic, but I think you have to hope that the level of insight around the impact of AI and the technical sophistication to really understand what's happening. Most people in a supply chain or customer service experience will never really understand the technology that's powering the experience they're having. And so the responsibility on this industry, whether it's small companies or large, that have the technical sophistication that is largely impenetrable to most business decision makers and users, is to have a high quality, better judgment of how to use the tech expertise that you have for good. And that's why I like this notion of having the Sustainable Development Goals, having ESG for your company, being very clear that you're positively trying to improve outcomes and experience. Because most people, most supply chains, most business people, most government ministers are never really going to understand the tech. And so the burden on the industry is actually quite high to be transparent and ethical.
Yeah. Okay. Just a couple more minutes. Let's stick to AI. We're going to talk a little bit more about, you mentioned machine learning, Alison, and we hear all the time now about bias and these training data. Just one example, you use Google Translate, you pop in the term "the engineer," and the Turkish translation will use the masculine form of the for the engineer. And this is just one of many examples of bias that creeps into algorithmic decision making. What do companies need to be doing differently? Vivian, you've talked a little bit about this, and Alison, do you have any thoughts on that? It's going a little bit deeper into the tech, but I'm curious.
Yeah, no, look, I think it's exactly the point around you need to be able to challenge the data, to challenge the output. I approach it from a very simple perspective, which is what you're trying to do is create a customer experience. At the end of whatever tech that you create, of wherever you use machine learning or AI or all the other areas that we're talking about, you're creating an interaction with a customer and an outcome for a customer. So what experience are you trying to create? And I think you've always got, as the tech team, and we do with our tech team when you're testing, thinking about where this will evolve to, the second and third order impact, the customer base that you're interacting with, that you want to interact with, and how it will expand. So I think it's very easy to design the first impact. I think you've got to think about where this evolves to and the unintended consequences of the various things. And I think as any business head, whether it's a global business or a regional business or a small business, you've got to think of your impact on your customer and the broader consequences of what you do. And I think that's something in the speed to get to market sometimes that can be forgotten. And I think you've got to think of those second order and expansive impacts from the customer perspective.
Okay, fantastic. So we've just got like 3 minutes left, and I'd love to, if either of you could just kind of a quick fire your top tips for women entrepreneurs or for women getting into the tech industry, if they're facing challenges, if there's blocks in their way. What are your tips to overcoming those challenges and getting ahead? Let's start with Vivian.
Well, the first thing I would say is fight onlyness. Any time that you're the only woman in the room or the only engineer in the room or the only fill in the blank in the room, you need to find allies. Now, oftentimes, most of my sponsors at McKinsey have been male, because the vast majority of partners I worked with when I joined the company a few years ago were male, and they were terrific sponsors, but I also had my she posse, right? I had a girlfriends who were also working in consulting and professional services, but just not at McKinsey. I also had my husband and a support network who I know when I mess up on projects or I get fired or it all just doesn't work out, then same as now, I know that he and my family will have their back. So when you are pioneering, the only woman on the VC pitch panel, you're the only woman on the team, when you're the only person with a tech background on a non-tech team, fight onlyness. Don't let yourself get isolated. You won't solve problems as well, and it won't be as enjoyable.
Wow, that was great. Alison, sorry, that's a tough one to follow.
No, look, totally agree. I think it's all about collaboration. Use your network, find a mentor, don't fight the battles on your own, work out what you can do. I mean, my fundamental advice to anyone who's, starting out as an entrepreneur, and, entrepreneurship is really lonely. It's just you, it's your idea.
Yep.
There is a huge amount of help out there. So never think you're asking a stupid question. Everybody's probably got the same question in their head. Go find help, go find networks, go find mentors. Find something you love doing. I mean, I think if you're, picking a career and it's something you don't enjoy, then you've already lost the battle. So you've got to do that. And constantly invest in learning and developing. I think as we move into a much more digitally technology-enabled environment, we've talked about the change in the workplace. Actually, everybody's job is going to be completely different. And so an adaptable and agile mindset and curiosity is probably the greatest thing you can take into any role.
Could I make one point about, we've got so many existing businesses. Last year, I think CogX was 7,000 participants. This year, it's 15,000. The UK is right at the top of the AI intensity transformation. We've got a lot of assets, resources, capabilities, technologies, and we also lead in terms of business standards and a quality operating context in which you can do business. The combination of those two things is very powerful. So AI businesses that are either powered by or based in the UK have a particular opportunity to lead, because it may feel hard when you're actually leading and driving your business, but you are in a leading position in this industry. And ask yourself, am I a rock star founder? Am I pushing for parity on my teams? Am I leading in the way that I really would be proud of, not just with the tech, but also with my choices for inclusion around gender and lots of other diversity that's in the sector?
Okay, fantastic. So just to sum up, fight the onlys, find your she posse, and always be learning and always be developing an agile mindset. These are fantastic practical tips. And thank you so much to Vivian and to Alison for taking the time and for these really fantastic insights. And thank you to our audience for listening as well.